Invasive species are exotic species that are successful. So basically, we have all of these exotic plants and animals that we've either come here by accident or on purpose. Some of them behave themselves perfectly in our environment. A lot of our crops are exotic species, but occasionally exotic species do very well here and they don't need our help and they reproduce excessively and start causing ecological harm. At that point, we call them invasive. So an invasive species is one that's not from here and is causing harm either to the environment or to the economy or to human health. Louisiana is particularly susceptible to invasion because of our mild climate, plenty of sunshine, plenty of rain, and of course our international ports. We have ships coming and going from all parts of the world. That's a major pathway for invasive species introductions. Some of the examples that we have here, I guess the nutria is sort of the poster child for invasive species. They were brought here on purpose and now they're well established throughout the coast and throughout the state and several other states as well.
Nutria were introduced in the late 1930s. They came from Argentina. They were brought over by a merchant marine for fur farms in Louisiana. The first fur farm they had was in Tangipahoa Parish. Subsequent to that, there was a fur farm in St. Bernard Parish, in the Houma area, and also on Avery Island that Mr. McElhenney of the Tabasco fame started. They ran until the early 40s. They were marginally successful. Most of them fell into economic collapse. The nutria were either accidentally or intentionally released into the coastal wetlands by these fur farmers. The assumption was that the alligators were going to decimate these populations that were released, but in fact did not, and the populations began to flourish.
They have this reproductive system that goes crazy. They can produce up to 12 offspring in one litter. They can also produce up to 3 litters a year. And they also start producing young when they are pretty young. They are able to outcompete our native muskrat. One thing about the nutria is that the locals often call them nutria rats. And they're really not a rat. They are actually related to a beaver. And they can eat up to 10 times their weight. This one right here is a juvenile. This is not a full-size adult. They have 2 types of fur. This helps it repel water. Inside there's a really soft, fine fur. Also on their back, the females have mammary glands on the upper part of their body, not on the under part. So they can feed their young while they're submersed in water.
For many decades, the fur industry kept the nutria in check. It peaked, I think, in the late 70s with about 2 million nutria pelts sold out of Louisiana in 1 year. Towards the mid to late 80s, the demand for fur dropped off precipitously. Basically, the industry kind of went bust, and it was no longer economically feasible to go out into the wetlands and trap nutria. So we saw that their numbers skyrocketed just from reproduction. Without an economic incentive, how do you control the nutria? Alligators will eat them, but there's not nearly enough alligators to control this rapidly reproducing rodent. The main problem with the nutria is, of course, it eats aquatic plants. It eats marsh grasses, and it eats them all the way down to the root, which, the plant will be killed that way, relinquish its hold on the soil is subject to further erosion. So we're finding that even from a helicopter, you can tell where these damaged areas in the marsh are of nutria damage, a nutria eat out. It's a very easy thing to spot. And there was a time when over 100,000 acres per year were being damaged by nutria. So this is a severe existential threat. This is not just another invasive species causing an ecological speed bump. This is the land being eaten out from under us by an invasive species. And with our problems with land loss already being the linchpin issue down here, this was an invasive species that desperately needed some control. So in 2000, we started a program using coastal restoration funds to get famous chefs involved and try to market nutria for human consumption. It didn't really work. There's a long list of great natural resources around here that are delicious before you get down the list and want to eat a nutria. They're definitely edible and it's good meat, it's high in protein, it's low in fat. But again, there's just too many other things that people would rather eat than a nutria. So that program didn't really fly. Then in 2002, the state of Louisiana decided, what if we just pay the trappers an incentive to go hunt the nutria? Well, that worked. So the trappers can still sell the pelt if they can find any value for the fur, or the meat if they can find any value for the meat, and they chop off the nutria's tail and turn them in. Nowadays, the trappers are getting $5 per tail. We're removing close to 400,000 nutria per year from the wetlands in the coastal zone. and we're spending a little bit less than $2 million a year to do that. And since the program began in 2000, the acres damaged that we can see from these helicopter surveys has steadily gone down. It peaked at nearly 100,000 acres per year of nutria damage in the late 90s. That's now down to under 10,000 acres per year damaged from nutria, so the program is definitely working.
We have about roughly 400 people apply to the program and about 300 or so that are active. This year we had 354,354 tails, but we average about 360,000.
Right now, through the past 10 years, we have over 3 million nutria that have been harvested by the program, and it's been very successful.
I think after 10 years, we've gotten things down to a T.
BitNep has two nutria projects as well. Righteous Fur, which is a design collective out of New Orleans that is doing nutria fur fashion shows and marketing of fashions and fashion accessories to drum up interest in the fur. And also Marsh Dog, a group in Baton Rouge who is using the meat for dog treats.
We knew about the problem that nutria created, so we've watched the various projects and efforts to control the nutria sort of come and go over the years. Once the concept was born and we talked about it, then I started doing more intense research into dog food and dog treats. A lot of the background or a lot of the scientific analyses of nutria meat had already been performed by LSU in connection with Chef Parola's efforts. So we were able to get that information and determine that it was really close to turkey meat, both in protein content, fat content, etc. As we started talking about the project, we thought it would make sense to make our treat with Louisiana products, so we started trying to work with those products to create the treat. One of the things that we're really hoping that happens with this product is create a real commercial market, a private enterprise market, which is going to supply the demand for the nutria meat so that the state can use those very scarce resources with regard to other projects in coastal restoration. And so that's part of the underlying mission of our product.
Righteous Fur is a company founded to create a new fashion market for nutria, because 98% of the nutria that are killed as part of the coastwide nutria control program are just destroyed. And it's really quite a beautiful fur, and the teeth, as you can see, are quite elegant if they're set properly. And the whole idea behind Righteous Fur is if you're going to kill an animal, you should use all parts of it, the same way the Native Americans always believed in that tradition. So I kind of think of this as a giant recycling project, among other things. We've been working with as many as 20 different designers, mostly from Louisiana, and they are all making one-of-a-kind couture pieces that incorporate nutria. I think it has a potential to be a really self-sustaining cottage industry. If we can create a larger market for this recycled fur, then the hunters and trappers will have further incentive to increase their yield. It's not just that they're a nuisance animal, it's that they are destroying a really fragile ecosystem, and if the wetlands go, so do they. I mean, we go, they go, everybody goes.
We also have several invasive fish. The Rio Grande cichlid, which was an aquarium species that got released, is now making its way through the estuary. Asian carp have made their way down the Mississippi and sort of invaded us from the north. We also fear the potential invasion of the snakehead, a fish from Asia that if it gets released, that could be a major problem. It's a very, very aggressive fish that is going to outcompete a lot of our natives.
In Louisiana, we have our native freshwater fishes like bass and bluegill, but we also have a lot of little fishes called live bearers or pisciliids, things you've probably heard of mosquito fishes and sailfin mollies. And what we've seen, at least with the Rio Grande cichlid, we see that they're competing for space with the bass and bluegill, but we also see declines in these smaller fishes, the fishes we don't really see a lot of, and we don't know how that interaction is occurring, but something's going on when this non-native fish is present. These little fishes are not doing well. Tilapia have been used in aquaculture species all over the planet, and every place where they escape, they've caused problems. Whether it's Venezuela, whether it's Southeast Asia, they get out, and again, these are animals that have been selected by the aquaculture process to survive at high densities, swimming around in their own fecal matter and surviving and reproducing. So you have these tough critters that have been selected to survive, and you get them out there and they can just outcompete, outgrow, outprotect their young than any native species out there. So they are just very, very hardy critters and very hard to get rid of. Asian carp are filter feeders. You have big head carp who feed on zooplankton, then you have silver carp who feed on phytoplankton. So you're kind of getting multiple trophic layers are being hit. So these are animals that can survive basically by opening their mouths and filtering the organisms that are in the water. So if you have more specific native fishes like buffalo, they are much more particular. They are not going to grow as quickly. They're not going to be able to reproduce as quickly as these Asian carp, and they're just using up the biomass that the native fishes should be eating. There's a term called invasional meltdown. They've been noticed in places like the Great Lakes. Once you get one invasive species there, it's a lot easier for a second and a third and then a fifth and a 10th invasive species. So you have a whole trophic collapse of the ecosystem.
The reason why this is relevant is because this same situation happened here in Louisiana with Port Sulphur. You had Rio Grande cichlids there. Then you had these hybrid blue Nile tilapia that popped up there after the Rio Grande cichlids here. So I've seen two separate cases there where you have one species there before the other one comes in is successful. And it's one of those things where after you see this happen, it's something you almost can't solve if it gets too far. We have all these different species being successful. A big problem with these species is the large amount of eggs they produce, up to 10,000 or so eggs. They take care of their young. If you're to compare it to a native fish, a bluegill, you have the male make a nest, female comes in, drops off eggs, and as soon as those eggs hatch, they're on their own. If you have cichlids, you have both the male and the female guarding the eggs hatch, they guard the young, they help feed the young weeks and weeks, you get up to a decent size, then they're on their own. So they have a much better head start, plus you're talking about thousands of fry doing this. So you can see in a very short amount of time, they can increase in population wherever they are. So I think the next big step with invasive species and understanding how to manage them is to prevent these things from being successful and overlapping and causing these invasive meltdowns here would actually facilitate each other's success in these habitats.
And the basis for the invasional meltdown idea is to weaken the local ecosystem. So it's like any other disturbance to the habitat. If you go in and you pave or make a bayou concrete, you've destroyed some habitat. If you put a non-native fish in there, you're throwing something off. The energy flow is disrupted. So you have a situation where you're making the habitat less sustainable. So if you put one invasive in there, you're kind of degrading the habitat. The natives are already having problems with competition and predation. That makes the system even more weak for bringing a second invasive in, or maybe a third or a fourth. And even though you might see something like a Rio Grande cichlid, well, they're not like piranha, they're not causing direct human damage. They're kind of opening the door for perhaps something like a snakehead that could really decimate the native fishes.
This was an artificially dug canal for the purposes of drainage, and when you dig an artificial canal, you're sort of disturbing the habitat. Disturbed habitats are more susceptible to invasion by invasive species. And eating on all of this stuff is our apple snails. Here you see the bright pink egg masses. Nothing else looks like that in the swamp. Highly, highly visible. It's an aquatic snail. It lives underwater, but it climbs out of the water to lay its eggs. That's an adaptation to keep their young away from predators. They're also really nasty tasting. They're full of a kind of an acidic goo, and the eggs themselves, of which there's 200 to 300 in each cluster, are calcium carbonate like a bird's egg. So there's really nothing that wants to eat that. Really, really good adaptation so that they're highly fecund and produce a lot of young. So one impregnated snail can lay a cluster like this every couple of months. It's a freshwater snail. It lives under the water, but it does have a primitive lung where it can survive out of the water for a good amount of time. It has a snorkel where it can actually stick a snorkel up and take gulps of air when the water quality is poor or if it feels it needs more oxygen. And they also climb out of the water when they're ready to lay these egg masses. The main problem with the apple snails is they're just voracious herbivores. So they're going to eat plants, submerged aquatic plants, and mostly indiscriminately. They'll eat just about anything that's a submerged aquatic plant. They have preference for taro, which here is an invasive, but in other parts of the world it's a major cash crop, and they've done horrible damage to taro around the world. Rice as well, they're a major rice pest. So that's the biggest concern here in Louisiana, is that these apple snails spread to the west where we have serious rice industry. Aside from the agricultural impacts, we also have ecological impacts. Apple snails will move into a water body. They're consuming all of the aquatic vegetation, all the submerged aquatic vegetation. And when there's no large aquatic plants, what we call macrophytes, then all of the nutrients in the water are going to support some kind of plant growth, and that's usually going to be algae. So if the snails are eating all the plants, then we transition from a lot of good fish habitat with submerged aquatic plants to no submerged aquatic plants, algae dominated, much more turbid, muddy, and bad looking water. There are some native animals that'll eat these guys. The raccoons do a pretty good job foraging at the water's edge. Mink and otters definitely, because they have the capability to dive. It's easy to find, it's easy to dig into, and it's a great meal if you're an otter. But in general, there is not nearly enough native predation to keep these guys in check. As you can see, imagine 200 to 300 eggs. Even if 50% of those hatch and fall in the water, there's a highly fecund species. They're gonna out-reproduce any predation that our native animals are gonna do. This is one of the hardest invasive species to control because, first of all, they're underwater, so they're really hard to get at. And with that second life stage out of the water, even if you had a perfectly functioning molluscicide that would selectively kill just the snails, you still have all of their unhatched young out of the water that would, in a couple of weeks, just hatch and fall back in. So any control that you would have to do would have to target the adults under the water and the eggs out of the water as well. Some of the biggest problems we have with invasive species are with the aquatic plants, especially in the Barataria terrebonne and in the rest of the coastal zone. Water hyacinth, hydrilla, salvinia, water lettuce, alligator weed, those are some of the really bad ones here, preventing boating access and fishing and ruining recreational uses, and in extreme cases they can clog municipal and industrial intakes. So with these aquatic plants in particular, there's environmental impacts, so they're shading out, they're out competing. There's economic impacts, so loss of functions and values of the system to humans. And then there's also cultural impacts for any invasive species. So when you lose your native plants and animals, you're losing that sense of place that makes your particular socio-cultural location so valuable. The problem with especially the floating aquatic plants is that they grow in such dense quantities that they shade out the water body. They can completely cover the surface of a canal or a bayou or a pond or a lake, and no sunlight can get through, which would otherwise be nourishing the underwater plants there. So they shade that out, they kill the native plants beneath them, and they also prevent gases from exchanging into the water.
When we say we're concerned about water quality, it can either be from a fish and wildlife point of view or from a human point of view. So basically the type of things in the water that affect human health are going to really be related to pathogenic bacteria. Okay, so the other side of it is fish and wildlife health. Okay, and in particular, fisheries need to have a high amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. So what normally produces dissolved oxygen in the water are going to be microscopic little plants like algae. So during the day, when the sun strikes the water column, it'll penetrate to a certain depth. That's called the photic zone. And so algae live within that photic zone, and then they're using that energy from the sun, and they're producing oxygen as a byproduct. So if we have aquatic plants like salvinia or water lettuce or water hyacinth that cover the surface of the water, it short circuits the process. So in addition to short circuiting things, they're blocking the sunlight, okay? So the sunlight can't penetrate into the photic zone, so you're not getting as much dissolved oxygen down into the water that's normally created by, say, algae in the water. And at the same time, at night, they're also using up the dissolved oxygen in their roots. So they're overall decreasing the dissolved oxygen in the water. And also, if you have a huge mass of floating plants on the water and they end up dying, say in the fall and winter, they'll tend to die off. That's a lot more organic matter going into the water, which increases respiration by bacteria, which also decreases dissolved oxygen levels. And so whenever you have low dissolved oxygen in the water column, it's harder for fish fish have to use dissolved oxygen in order to breathe, in order to live, in order to digest their food.
And just right here, I'm seeing no less than 5 invasive aquatic plants. This is water hyacinth, And fortunately, there's just small pockets of it here and there, but frequently this can get very, very dense, very thick, and cover a whole surface. This is alligator weed, another invasive that, like hyacinth, has been here a very, very long time. Here's a little spot of Myriophyllum, or parrot feather. This is a early stage growth of common salvinia, a floating fern that's a major problem, also can make a very dense covering. And another one, this is a young water lettuce plant. So for control, we have mechanical control, basically where it's just physical action. You go in and physically remove. That might be chopping down trees or gathering up the plants, weeding your garden. We also have chemical control, the use of pesticides and herbicides, maybe poisons or baits. The chemical control of aquatic plants is particularly problematic because you don't want to introduce anything into our waterways. It's a water quality issue. There are many fewer herbicides that are approved for aquatic use than there are on the land. So that can be a challenge. One of my preferred methods is biocontrol. That's releasing another organism to control an invasive organism. And we have had some horror stories in the past by doing that without doing the proper amount of research first. But these days it's strictly controlled by the Animal and Plant Health Inspection Service. And frequently an insect and a plant has a very, very specific relationship. We have found that a lot of insects are entirely host specific. Salvinia, for example, has a great biocontrol agent. It's the Salvinia weevil. Certabagus salvinii has even got the name of the plant in its scientific name. It's so host specific, the adults feed on the Salvinia plant, it lays its eggs on the Salvinia plant, and the larval forms also eat the Salvinia. In the absence of Salvinia, the weevil dies because it doesn't have anywhere to reproduce. So that's a perfect example of a very target-specific biocontrol agent. And researchers have discovered that by going back to the native range of Salvinia in South America and finding an insect that can do that. So frequently, the invasive gets introduced and is freed from that background system of checks and balances that kept it in check in its native range. So the trick is to go back to the native range and find what it was that was keeping that species in control in its native range. So with Salvinia, that's been working pretty well for us.
We started also experimenting last summer with a hydrilla fly. It's a microscopic fly that specifically lays its eggs on hydrilla plants. When the eggs hatch out, the larva of the fly burrows into the stem of the hydrilla plant and basically starts eating its way in from the outside. If you can get a thick enough concentration of these larvae in the hydrilla infestation, it'll stress it out to where other environmental factors will kind of kill it off and keep it at bay.
What we practice is classical biocontrol. So essentially what we're trying to do is reunite the natural herbivores of the plant with themselves here in the country. As you know, most of our invasive species were introduced from overseas, either accidentally or on purpose, and they're usually brought here without their complement of native herbivores and such, pathogens as well. And so what we're trying to do is try to reunite those agents with the plants here in the U.S. to be able to affect some kind of control and reduce its competitive suppression. I think that's an important part of biocontrol. We don't look for complete control, we're looking for suppression of those plant species, and that's an important part of biocontrol. So in the classical approach, we go overseas, we make lists of potential herbivores, we then test those overseas to see if they have any kind of impact and then make sure they're only feeding on that plant species. We bring those then into quarantine here in the U.S. and we test them for many years under a variety of different testing procedures. And many times we starve the insects and give them a choice and then they go out there. They may be in quarantine 5 to 10 years. Finally, we get approval from APHIS, USDA APHIS, for release of those agents and we put them in the field. And what we tend to do is release small numbers of those agents relative to the amount of plants, and we use the intrinsic population growth of the agents that we put out there. We use those to increase the populations and afford an impact. An important part of what we do is we try to release the agents from overseas without their complement of things that feed or parasitize them as well. So they're actually what they call an enemy release hypothesis. So we're trying to release those agents from any controlling factors they had in their native country so they can impact the ones over here. Biocontrol is very safe. There's been very few cases where we've had movement of an insect that was shown to be safe in the quarantine testing to move over to other plant species. One thing that you got to realize is that host specificity in insects is a very strong relationship. It's not like you hear about bacteria moving over. It's very strong. It takes millions of years to form a host-specific relationship with an insect, and typically that occurs when usually a dietary component that they have to have in their diet, or something that forces them to feed, a gustatory component. So it's a very strong relationship. It doesn't happen. Hydrilla is a good one because we only have one species of that in the country, so it's only going to feed on that one particular species.
You know, we're up to our necks in a lot of aquatic plants, but we have problems with terrestrial plants as well. This is catclaw vine. That's another in the many long list of invasive species that we have. This is from South America, and it's a vine that grows along the ground until it finds something to climb, and it'll climb a full-grown, healthy adult tree all the way to the top canopy and shade it out, completely cover it, and this vine is capable of killing full-grown adult trees. Well, we're here in an urban park, so this is a setting where, you know, I could come and just clip these vines and save the canopy, and the tree would be fine. Next season, I'm going to have to come and do it again because it's all over the ground and it's just going to climb the tree again. If left alone, this tree might be completely covered, I don't know, in less than 5 or 10 years. This vine is not only capable of killing an individual tree, but, you know, if it gets out into the wild, the extra weight of the vines on the tree and the shade that it's causing is going to, in high wind situations, especially hurricanes, we're going to have a lot of limb breakage and possibly some complete uprooting, and so you end up transforming the whole habitat from, you know, a high forest canopy dominated system to scrub and brush, you know, vine dominated system. In Louisiana, I think we spend more money and more control efforts on the aquatic stuff because navigation must go on, and, you know, boating and recreation and fishing are all really big industries down here. To the detriment, I think, of some of the terrestrial invasives like the Chinese tallow. A lot of work is done with Chinese tallow, no doubt, but very little work is done with catclaw vine, for example. This is the Chinese tallow tree, another great scourge across the southeast United States. Brought here over 200 years ago for these little fruits. They're full of tallow, so it's great for candle making, soap making, which were big industries 200 years ago. Then it was later promoted as a landscape plant. Beekeepers really love tallow for these flowers. Bees do tend to gravitate towards them, but that's about it. Everybody else hates them because they're fast-growing pioneers. Another perfect example of an invasive species that comes into a disturbed habitat and ends up dominating. We see huge monocultures where there's nothing but Chinese tallow growing. Especially when in a disturbed habitat. A lot of invasive species come here by accident. They'll be in the ballast water of a ship, for example, or in the packing material, and no one intended to have an accidental release or introduction, but frequently they are brought here on purpose. They have some desirable characteristic that we like, an ornamental flower, a delicious fruit, an exotic pet. So I think what we really need in the future of invasive species control is better legislation. We have the Lacey Act, which is a 100-year-old piece of legislation that says we can regulate a species once it's declared injurious. Well, it's not injurious until it's injuring somebody. By then it's too late, the introduction has already occurred. So what we need is proactive legislation that says that maybe the burden of proof should be on the importer. Can you demonstrate that this is a safe species to bring in? There have been efforts legislatively already. Some have failed. Some were maybe an overreach where we wanted to create a whitelist. All you can bring in is these species that we've already deemed that are safe. Well, that might be a little bit too restrictive. I personally don't think so, but some people did. That effort at legislation failed. Some states don't have the resources, and so I think what we need is federal legislation to update the Lacey Act and have a proactive approach at exotic plant and animal imports. There's several different methods of control for invasive species, but the future of invasive species management is combinations of all of these things. We need holistic programs that incorporate, you know, spraying when and where it's necessary and appropriate, a lot of funding for biocontrol studies so we can determine which of these biocontrol agents are safe to be released, volunteers getting out there and chopping down tallow and pulling down catclaw, legislative outreach, better laws to prevent exotic plants and animals from getting here in the first place, and reestablishing of native species. That's a big part of the picture. Is, you know, that's the all-important flip side to fighting invasives, is promoting the natives. Habitats that aren't disturbed are less likely to be invaded, so habitat restoration is a critical component of invasive species management. BitNEP has a very robust volunteer program. We do a lot of native species plantings. We also do invasive species removal. So as natural resource managers, we have to go out there and assess the environment. We need to know what's in its place and what's out of place. And we have to be able to respond rapidly. When we see an invasive species come in, you don't want to wait too long and let it get out of control. So you go in with a rapid response. You hope that your control efforts worked. You have to go back out again and reassess and see if what you did was successful or not. And then you may have to respond again, you may have to assess again, and you can see how this is just a never-ending cycle. Invasive species is not a problem that's going to be solved or go away one day. It's a constant management issue.